Chapter 28 of The Valley of the Squinting Windows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Valley of the Squinting Windows by Brinsley MacNamara. Chapter 28. After she had failed to take her tea, Rebecca walked the valley road many times, passing and repassing their usual meeting place, but no sign of Ulick did she find. She peered longingly into the sea of white fog, but he did not come. What in the world was happening to him at all? Never before had he missed this night of the week. She did not care to return so early, for she feared that Mrs. McGoldrick might come with that awful look of scrutiny she detested. Just to pass the time, she wandered down the road of the dead towards the lake. Tonight it seemed so lonely set there amid the sea of white. It was strange to think that this place could ever have had a fair look about it or given pleasure to any person at all. Yet it was here that John Brennan had loved to walk and dream. She wondered how it was with him now. She began to think of the liking he had shown for her. Maybe he fancied she did not know why he happened to meet her so often upon the road. But well did she know, and to think that he had come to look up at her window this evening. Yet even now she was fearful of acknowledging these things to herself. It appeared as a double sacrilege. It was an attack upon her love for Ulick, and it questioned the noble intention of Mrs. Brennan in devoting her son to God. But all chance that it might ever come to anything was now over. The ending had been effected by herself in the parlor of Tommy Williams. The Gombeen man, and Mrs. Brennan might never be able to guess the hand she had had in it. It was a thing upon which she might well pride herself if there grew in her the roots of pride. But she was not of that sort. And now she was in no frame of delight at all, for the thought of him had united her unto the thought of Ulick, and Ulick had not come to her this evening. She felt herself growing cold in the enveloping mist. The fir trees were like tall ghosts in the surrounding gloom. But immediately the lake had lost its aspect of terror when she remembered what she had done might have averted the possibility of having John Brennan ever again to wander lonely. And yes, in spite of any comforting thought, the place would continue to fill her with a nameless dread. She was shivering and expectant. Suddenly a big pike made a splash among the reeds, and Rebecca gave a loud, wild cry. It rang all down the lonely aisle of the fir trees, and united its sound with that of a lone bird crying on the other side of the lake. Then it died upon the banks of mist up against the silent hills. For a few moments its source seemed to flutter and bubble within her breast, and then it ended in a long, sobbing question to herself. Why had she cried out at all? She might have known it was only a fish or some such harmless thing, and anyone within reasonable distance could have heard the cry and thought it was the signal of some terrible thing that had happened here by the lakeside. It was not so far distant from two roads, and who knew but someone had heard. Yet she could hardly fancy herself behaving in this way if she had not possessed an idea that it was a lonely place, and seldom that anyone went by in the night time. But she hurried away from the feeling of terror she had caused to fill the place and back towards the house of Sergeant McGoldrick. As quickly as possible she got to bed. Here seemed a little comfort. She remembered how this had been her place of refuge as a child, how she felt safe from all ghosts and goblins once her head was hidden beneath the clothes, and the instinct had survived into womanhood. Again a series of those fitful half-sleeping and waking conditions began to pass over her. Side by side with the most dreadful feelings of impending doom came thronging memories of glad phases of life through which she had passed. And to think that this life of hers was now narrowing towards this end. Were the valley and its people to behold her final disaster? Was it to be that way with her? She had intended to tell Ulick if he had come to her this evening. But he had not come, and what was she to do now? In the slough of her torment, she could not think of the right thing. Maybe if she wrote an angry letter upbraiding him. But how could she write an angry letter to him? Yet she must let him know, and immediately. When the dawn had broken into the room, she would write. For there was no use in thinking of sleeping. She could not sleep. Yes, when the dawn had broken into the room, she would write surely, but not an angry letter. Very slowly she began to notice the corners of the room appearing in the new light before her wide-open eyes, and to feel that this was the place she had so fiercely hated from the first moment of setting foot in it, and that it was now about to see her write the acknowledgment of her shame. The dawn was a great while in breaking. If he did not, well then, what could her future life hope to be? She began to grow strangely dizzy as she fell to thinking of it, dizzy and fearful as she drew near in mind to that very great abyss. The leaping up of the day did not fill her with any of its gradual delight. She rose with a weariness numbing her limbs. The putting on of her few clothes was an immense task. She went to the table upon which she had written all those letters to her school companions which described that there was nothing like a girlfriend. She pulled towards her, with a small trembling hand, the box of ancient Irish vellum, which upon her special letters were always written. Her mind had focused itself to such small compass that this letter seemed more important than any that had ever been written in this world. But for a long time she could not begin. She did not know by what term of endearment to address him now. They had been so particularly intimate, and then it was so hard to describe her condition to him in poor words of writing with pen and ink upon paper. If only he had come to her last night, it might have been a task of far less difficulty. A few sobs, a gathering of her little troubled body onto him, and a beseeching look up into his face. But it was so hard to put any single feeling into any separate sentence. After hours, during which the sun had been mounting high and bright, she had the letter finished at last and was reading it over. Some sentences like the following leaped out before her eyes here within this sickly-looking room. Whatever was the matter with him that he could not come to her? Surely he was not so blind, and he with his medical knowledge, he must know what was the matter with her, and that this was scarcely the time to be leaving her alone. His uncle, Miles Shannon, was a very rich man, and did he not remember how often he had told her how his uncle looked with favor upon her? Here she included the very words in which Ulick had many a time described his uncle's opinion of her. I like that little schoolmistress Rebecca Kerr. It was all so grand, Ulick, our love and meetings, but here comes the paying of the penalty, and surely you will not leave poor little me to pay it in full. You have enjoyed me, have you not, Ulick? She was more immediately personal now, and this was exactly how the sentences continued. You know very well what this will mean to me. I'll have to go away from here, and where, I ask you, can I go? Not back to my father's house, surely, nor to my aunt's little cottage in Donegal. I have no money. The poor salary I earn here is barely able to buy me a little food and clothing and keep a roof over my head. Did I not often tell you that when you were away from me there were times when I could hardly afford the price of stamps? If it should happen that this thing become public, while I am yet here I could never get another day's teaching. For Father O'Keefe would warn every manager in Ireland against engaging me. But surely, darling, you will not allow things to go so far. You will please come down to see me at 5:30 this evening. You will find me at the old place upon the Road of the Dead. Don't you remember that it was there we had our first talk, Ulick? Great as the torture of writing it had been, the torture of reading it was still greater. Some of the lines seemed to lash out and strike her and to fill her eyes with tears. and there were some that seemed so hard upon him that she struck them out, not wishing, as ever, to hurt her dearest Ulick at all. At one moment she felt a curious desire to tear it into pieces and let her fate come to her as it had been ordained from the beginning. But there was little Euphemia McGoldrick knocking at the door to be allowed to enter with the breakfast. Who would ever imagine that it was so late? She had written a great deal. Why, it filled pages and pages. She hurriedly thrust it into a large envelope that she had bought for the purpose of sending a card of greeting to John Brennan at Christmas, thinking better of it only at the last moment. It was useful now, for the many sheets were bulky. "The breakfast, miss," announced Euphemia as she left the room. This was the third meal in 24 hours that Rebecca could make no attempt to take, but, to avert suspicion, she wrapped up the sliced and buttered bread in a few leaves from the novelette from which she had read those desperate passages on the previous evening. The tea she threw out into the garden. It fell in a shining shower down over the bright green vegetables. She put on her dust coat and, stuffing the letter to Ulick into one pocket and her uneaten breakfast by way of a luncheon she would not eat into the other, hurried out of doors and up the road. For this morning she had important business in the village before going on to the school. Mrs. McGoldrick was set near the foot of the stairs holding Euphemia and Clementina by the hand, all three in action there to behold the exit of Rebecca. This was a morning custom and something in the nature of a rite. It was the last cloud of torture always inflicted by Mrs. McGoldrick. Rebecca went on into Garadrimna. The village street was deserted save by Thomas James, who held solitary occupation. He was posting the bills for a circus at the market square. She was excited as she went over to speak to him and did not notice the eyes of the bespectacled postmistress that were trained upon her from the office window with the relentlessness of howitzers. She asked Thomas James would he take a letter from her to Mr. Ulick Shannon. "Oh, yes, miss. Oh, Lord, yes." She slipped the letter into his hand when she thought that no one was looking. She had adopted this mode of caution in preference to sending it through the post office. She was evidently anxious that it should be delivered quickly and unread by any other person. "Oh, Lord, yes, miss. Just as soon as I have an auction bill posted after this. You know, miss, that McKean Cannellan, the auctioneer, is one of my best patrons. He doesn't pay as well as the circus people, but he pays oftener." That was in the nature of a very broad hint, for Rebecca had anticipated it, and had the shilling already prepared and ready to slip into his other hand. "Thanks, miss." With remarkable alacrity, Thomas James had downed tools and disappeared into Brannigan's. Rebecca could hear the swish of his pint as she went by the door after having remained a few moments looking at the lurid circus bills. Inside, Mrs. Brannigan, the publican and victualler's wife, took notice that he possessed the air of a man bent upon business. "Ah, it's how I'm going to do a little message for the assistant schoolmistress," he said, taking his matutinal pinch of salt, for this was his first pint, and one could never tell what might happen. "Is that so? Aye, indeed, a letter to young Shannon. Well now, and why for wouldn't it do to send it by the post?" "Ah, maybe that way wouldn't be grand enough for her. Maybe it is what it would be to shape. A penny, you know, for the stamp, and this cost a shilling for the porter. Give us another volume of this, Mrs. Brannigan, if you please. Ha, ha, ha." He laughed loudly, but without any mirth, at his own joke and the peculiar blend of subtlety by which he had marked it. Mrs. Brannigan was all anxiety and excitement about the letter. "Well now, just imagine," she said to herself about 40 times as she filled the second pint for Thomas James. Then she rose up from her bent posture at the half-barrel and, placing the drink before him on the bar, said, "I wonder what would be in that letter. Let me see. Oh, 'tis only a letter in a big envelope. Aren't you the inquisitive woman now, Mrs. Brannigan? What'll you have, Thomas?" "Ah, another pint, Mrs. Brannigan, thanks." His second drink had been dispatched with his own celebrated speed. Mrs. Brannigan was a notably hard woman, and he could not let the opportunity of having her stand him a drink go by. She was the hardest woman in Garadrimna. Her childlessness had made her so. She was beginning to grow stale and withered, and anything in the nature of love and marriage, with their possible results, was to her a constant source of affliction and annoyance. Her heart was now bounding within her breast in curiosity. "Drink that quick, Thomas, and have another before the boss comes down." But there was no need to command him. It had already disappeared. The fourth pint had found its way to his lips. He was beginning to grow mellow now, and to lose his cross-sickness of the morning. "Will you let me see the letter?" "Certainly, Mrs. Brannigan. Oh, Lord, yes." He handed it across the counter. "Such a queer letter. Oh, I hear the boss coming in across the yard." She had taken the empty glass from before Thomas James, and again was it filled. Her husband stood before her, and this was the moment she had worked up to so well. "I'll hand it back to you when he goes out," she whispered. "All right, ma'am." Thomas James and Mr. Brannigan fell into a chat while she went towards the kitchen. She took the letter from her flat bosom, where she had hastily thrust it, and looked at it from every possible angle. It seemed to possess a compelling attraction, but she could not open it here. She would run across to her friend the postmistress, who had every appliance for an operation of the kind. Besides, she was the person who had first right to open it. Soon the bespectacled maid and the barren woman were deep in examination of Rebecca Kerr's letter to Ulick Shannon. Into their minds was beginning to leap a terrible joy as they read the lines that had cost Rebecca immense torture to write. "This is great, said the ancient postmistress, clicking her tongue continually in satisfaction. "The cheek of her, mind you, not to send it by the public post like another. But I knew well there was something queer when I saw her colloguing with Thomas James at the market square. Wasn't she the sly, hateful little thing? Why, you'd never have thought it of her. A grand person indeed to have in charge of little innocent girls. Indeed, I shouldn't like to have a child if I thought it was to a pretty thing like that she'd be sent to school. Nor me, said the old lady, from whom the promise of motherhood had departed for many a long year. They shook in righteous anger and strong detestation of the sin of Rebecca Kerr, and together they held counsel as to what might be the best thing to do. They closed the letter, and Mrs. Brannigan again stuck it into her bosom. What should they do? The children must be saved from contamination anyhow. An approach to solution of the difficulty immediately presented itself. For there was Mrs. Wise herself just passing down the street with her ass-load of children. Mrs. Brannigan rushed out of the office and called, "Mrs. Wise, I want to see you in private for just a minute." The schoolmistress bent over the back of the trap, and they whispered for several minutes. At last, out of her shocked condition, Mrs. Wise was driven to exclaim, "Well now, isn't that the limit?" It seemed an affront to her authority that another should have first discovered it, so she was anxious to immediately recover her lost position of superiority. Sure, I was having my suspicions of her since ever she come back from the Christmas holidays, and even Monica McKeon, too, although she's a single girl and not supposed to know. It's a terrible case, Mrs. Brannigan. Terrible, Mrs. Wise. One of the terriblest ever happened in the valley, and before the children and all. God bless and save us. But we must only leave it in Father O'Keefe's hands. He'll know what is best to do, never fear. I'll send for him as soon as I get to the school." There was a note of mournful resignation in her tones as she moved away in the ass trap with her children. Like an old hen in the midst of her brood, there was a peculiar smirk of satisfaction about the lips of Mrs. Brannigan as she returned to the shop, bent upon sending the letter on its way once more. "Much good it'll do her now, the dirty little fool," she said in the happiness of some dumb feeling of vengeance against one who was merely a woman like herself. But she was a woman who had never had a child, Thomas James was considerably drunk. He had spent the remainder of the shilling upon porter, and Mr. Brannigan had stood him another pint. "Be sure and deliver it safely now, for maybe it's important," said Mrs. Brannigan as she returned the letter. "It's a great letter, anyhow. It's after getting me 9 pints. That's long over half a crown's worth of drink," he said, laughing foolishly as he wandered out to do his errand. It was a hard journey across the rising meadows to the house of Miles Shannon, where dwelt his nephew Ulick. Thomas James fell many times and wallowed in the tall green grass, and he fell as he went leaping high hedges and cut his hands and tore his red face with briars until it was streaked with blood. He was, therefore, an altogether deplorable figure when he at last presented himself at the house of Miles Shannon. Mr. Shannon came to the door to meet him, and in his fuddled condition he laughed to himself as he fished the letter out of his pocket. It was covered red with blood where he had felt it with his torn hand from time to time to see whether or not he still retained possession of it. "From Mr. Brannigan, I suppose," said Mr. Shannon, thinking it had been written hurriedly by the victualler just fresh from the slaughter-house, and that it was a request for prime beef or mutton from the rich fields of Scarden. He opened it, for his nephew's name on the envelope could not be seen through the blood-stains. He did not notice that it began, "My dearest Ulick," until he read down to the sentences that gave him pause. Thomas James was coughing insinuatingly beside him, so he took half a crown from his pocket and handed it to the bedraggled messenger. It was a tremendous reward, and the man of Porter did not fully perceive it until he had slipped out into the sunlight. "Be the holy farmer," he stuttered, "another half-crown's worth of drink, and I after drinking long more than that already. That was the best letter I ever got to carry in me life. A few more like it, and I'd either get me death of drink or be a millionaire like John D. Rockefeller or Andrew Carnegie." Inside the parlor, Miles Shannon was reading Rebecca Kerr's letter with blanched face. Here was a terrible thing. Here had come to him this great trouble for the second time. Something the like of this had happened 25 or 6 years ago, when his brother had been in the same case with Nan Byrne. Curious how it should be repeating itself now. He pondered it for a few moments in its hereditary aspect, but there was more in it than that. There was the trace of his own hand determining it. He had encouraged his nephew with this girl. He had directed him into many reckless ways just that he might bring sorrow to the heart of Nan Byrne and the destruction of her son. It was a wicked thing for him to have done. His own nephew. Just to satisfy his desire for revenge. And at the bottom of things he loved his nephew even as he had loved his brother Henry. But he would try to save him the results. The pains and penalties of his infatuation, even as he had tried to save his brother Henry the result of his. But the girl and her fate, he would not be able to forget that until his dying day. For it was he who had done this thing entirely. Done it in cold blood, too, because he had heard that John Brennan had soft eyes for Rebecca Kerr, and that, to encourage his nephew and produce a certain rivalry, might be the very best means of ruining the fair promise of Nan Byrne's son. Only last night he had heard from Ulick that John Brennan had entered the college at Ballinamult, and that his prospects never looked so good as at present. To think of that now was to see how just it was that his scheme should have so resulted, for it had been constructed upon a very terrible plan. He had done it to avenge his defeated love for one girl, and lo, it had brought another to her ruin. "Your uncle is a wealthy man." This sentence from the letter burned before him, and he thought for a moment that here appeared the full solution of the difficulty. But no. Of what use was that when the dread thing was about to happen to her? But for all that he would send her money today or tomorrow in some quiet way, and tell her the truth and beseech her to go away before the final disgrace of discovery fell upon her. His nephew must not know. He was too young to marry now, least of all, a compulsory marriage after this fashion to a schoolmistress. It was an ascent in the social standing of the girl, surely, for his brother Henry had disgraced himself with a mere dressmaker. But any connection beyond the regrettable and painful mistake of the whole thing was out of the question because, for long years, the Shannons had been almost gentlemen in the valley. Ulick came into the room now. Anything strange, Uncle? Oh, nothing at all. Only a letter from Mr. Brannigan about the sheep. I suppose you're not going anywhere today. Please don't, for I want you to give me a hand with the lambs after the shearing, and tonight I'll want you to help me with some letters and accounts that I've let slip for ever so long. I want you particularly. All right, Uncle. How tractable and obliging his nephew had become. Last summer he would not do a thing like this for any amount of coaxing. He would have business in the valley at all times, but there was a far power that adjusted matters beyond the plans of men. Ulick had drifted out of the room, and Mr. Shannon again took the letter from his pocket. The sight of the blood upon it still further helped the color of his thoughts towards terror. He crossed hurriedly to the bureau and slipped it beneath the elastic band which held his letters from Helena Cooper, and Mrs. Brennan's letter to her, and Mrs. Brennan's letter to his dead brother Henry. It seemed to belong there by right of the sad quality which is the distinction of all shattered dreams. And, just imagine, he had considered his a wonderful scheme of revenge, but now it seemed a poor and a mean thing. He could hardly think of it as a part of the once proud, easy-going Miles Shannon, but rather the bitter and ugly result of some devilish prompting that had come to him here in the lone stretches of his life in this quiet house among the trees. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of The Valley of the Squinting Windows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Valley of the Squinting Windows by Brinsley MacNamara. Chapter 29. More than ever on this morning was Rebecca aware that the keen eye of Mrs. Wise was upon her as she moved about the schoolroom. One of the bigger girls was dispatched to the other school from Monica McEwen, and Master Dinellan's assistant came in to Mrs. Wise. She nodded the customary greeting to Rebecca as she passed in. This interview was unusual at such an early hour of the day, but it was never the custom of either of them to tell her of what they were talking. As she busied herself teaching the very smallest of the children, she felt that the eyes of both women were upon her. After what appeared to be a very long time, Monica passed out. On this second occasion she looked loftily across her glasses and gave no nod of acknowledgment to Rebecca. Rebecca blushed at this open affront. She felt that Mrs. Wise must have something against her, something she had told Monica just now, and now the principal was exceedingly busy with her pen, as if writing a hurried note. Rebecca heard the high, coarse voice raised in command. "Euphemia McGoldrick, I want you." Then came the timid, "Yes, Mom," of Euphemia. "Here are 2 letters, child. Take this one to Father O'Keefe, your parish priest, and this to your mother, like a good child." "Yes'm." Some fear of unknown things began to stir in the breast of Rebecca. This connection of Mrs. Goldrick with Mrs. Wise's occupation of the morning seemed to announce some dragging of her into the matter. But as yet, although her mind moved tremulously in this excitement, she had curiously enough no suspicion of what was about to happen. It could not be that Mrs. Wise had suspected. Oh, not at all. There was still no danger. But it might be a near thing. Already she had begun to wonder, would Ulick come tonight? But of course he would come. He was not such a bad fellow. And he might be taken up with his own condition just now. He had missed his examination in Dublin, missed it, maybe, through his foolishness in coming to see her. But already she had thoroughly blamed herself for this. To ease the pain of her mind, she went busily about her work. She knew that the eye of Mrs. Wise was upon her, and that the very best way of defeating it was by putting on this air of industry. The day in its half-hour divisions was passing rapidly towards noon. A little girl came quickly in to say that Father O'Keefe was coming up the road. Rebecca glanced out of the window, and sure enough, there he was upon his big fat white horse coming into the yard. She heard his loud cries calling into the boys' school for a chap to come out and hold his horse. When the boy came to do his bidding, he held forth at great length upon the best way of leading King Billy around the yard. Then the Reverend Manager of Tullahanogue Schools moved into the female portion of the establishment. At the door he twisted his round face into an aspect of severity, which was still humorous in its alien incongruity. Here also he removed his hat from his head, which was white and bald, like the apex of an egg above the red curve of his countenance. It was his custom to visit the schools of which he was manager, thus precociously to make up in some way for what he lacked in educational knowledge and enthusiasm. As his short, squat figure moved up the passage by the desks, the massive head bowed low upon the broad chest, and the fat fingers of both hands coiled behind his back. He was not at all unlike an actor made up as Napoleon Bonaparte. His voice was disciplined in the accents of militarism and dictatorship. Rebecca noticed on the instant that today he was as one intensified. He began to slap his legs continuously with his silver-mounted riding whip. He did not speak to her as he passed in, but although it caused her heart to flutter for a moment, this appeared to her as no unusual occurrence. He never took notice of her, unless when she called at the vestry after Mass, upon occasion to deliver up a slice of her salary in dues and offerings. Then the Napoleonic powerfulness disappeared, and he fell to talking, with laughter in his words, about the richness of royal Meath in comparison with the wild barrenness of Donegal. He moved up to where Mrs. Wise was at work. Rebecca could distinctly hear the loud, "Well, what's your best news?" with which he always prefaced his conversations. In low whispers they began to communicate. It was not till now that she began to have immense doubts as to the purpose of his visit, and already she was trembling in presence of the little children. An example of her, father. Oh, yes, an example of her. Nothing less, Mrs. Wise. The words came down to Rebecca clearly through the deep silence that had fallen upon the school since the entrance of Father O'Keefe. The bigger girls were listening in a great hush of patience for all that had to be reported when they went home. Each one was preparing for her respective examination. Was there anyone in the school today? Yes, Mother. Who, the inspector? No, the priest. Father O'Keefe? Well, anything else? He was talking to Mrs. Wise. And what was he saying? I couldn't hear, Mother, so I couldn't. And why didn't you listen? What am I slaving myself to send you to school for? And so they were listening with such eagerness now. They were looking down at Rebecca as if she were the object of the whole discussion. Her thoughts were beginning to well into a swirling unconsciousness. Great sounds, like those of roaring cataracts, and the drumming of mighty armies were rolling up to her ears. Father O'Keefe and Mrs. Wise now came down the schoolroom together. As they passed Rebecca, Father O'Keefe beckoned to her with his riding whip, in the way one might call to a very inferior hireling. Shaken by unique and powerful impulses, she went out into the hallway to meet her superiors. Instantaneously, she knew what had happened. They knew. "Well, isn't this a nice thing?" began Father O'Keefe. "You might say it's a nice thing, Father," echoed Mrs. Wise. "An enormous thing. A terrible thing, Father." "You're a nice lady," he said, addressing Rebecca angrily, "to come into a parish where there is none save decent people, to leave a black disgrace upon it, and you going away. Was ever the like known, Father? And just imagine her keeping it so secret. Why, we thought there was nothing in the affair with Ulick Shannon. There was such an amount of cuteness in the way they used to meet at times and in places we never knew of. In the woods, I suppose." Father O'Keefe was addressing her directly again. Why, when I think of the disgrace to this school and all that, it drives me near mad. And mind you, the shocking insult is to me and to the little children. The shocking insult to you and to the little children. True for you, Mrs. Wise. And when I think of how you have contrived to besmirch the fair name of one of the fine respectable families of the parish, gentlemen, as you might say, without one blot upon their escutcheon, people as high up as the Hoolahans of Clonabroney. People as high up as the Hoolahans of Clonabroney, Mrs. Wise. His eye was upon Rebecca with a sudden gleam. When I think of that, I consider it an enormous offense. She did not flinch before them. She was thinking only of the way in which they had come to hear it. She was concerned now that Ulick should not suffer, that his grand family name should not be dragged down with hers. If he had not come to her, she would have slipped away without a word. And now to think that it had become public. The previous burning of her mind had been nothing to this. But Father O'Keefe was still speaking. "Listen to me, girl. You are to go from hence, but not, as you may imagine, to the place from whence you came. For this very evening I intend to warn your pastor of your lapse from virtue while in our midst, so that you may not return to your father's house, and have no more hope of teaching in any national school within the 4 seas of Ireland." "This is only right and proper, Father," put in Mrs. Wise. Rebecca was not listening, or else she might have shuddered within the shadow of the torture his words held for her. In these moments she had soared far beyond them. Through the high mood in which she was accepting her tragedy, she was becoming exalted. What glorious moments there would be! What divine compensation in whispering of the torture surrounding its beginning to the little child when it came. "So now, Rebecca Kerr, I command you to go forth from this school, and from the little children that you corrupt towards your own abomination by further presence among them." As he moved angrily out of the school, she moved quietly, and without speaking a word, to take her coat and hat down from the rack. "Oh, wait," commanded Mrs. Wise. "You must not leave until 3, until you have made an example of yourself here, in a way that all the children may bring home the story. God knows it'll be the hard thing for them to be telling their mothers when they go home. The poor little things." Rebecca stood there desolately alone in the hallway through the remainder of the afternoon. In one aspect she appeared as a bold child, being thus corrected by a harsh superior. On many more occasions than appeared absolutely necessary, Monica McEwen passed and repassed her, as she stood so lonely. The assistant of the boys' school was a model of disdain as, with her lip curled, she looked away out over her glasses. And ever and anon Mrs. Wise passed in and out, muttering mournfully to herself. The cheek of that now, before the children and all. And the elder girls moved about her in a procession of sneering. They knew, and they were examining her for the purpose of giving full accounts when they went home. But occasionally some of the little ones would come and gaze up into her eyes with wild looks. Although they did not know why, they seemed to possess for her an immense mute pity. "Poor Mrs. Kerr," they would say, stroking her dress. But their big sisters would come and whisk them away. "Don't touch her, she's dirty." Then Monica would pass again. At last she heard the merciful stroke of 3. End of chapter 29. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 30 of The Valley of the Squinting Windows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Valley of the Squinting Windows by Brinsley MacNamara. Chapter 30. When John Brennan went to his room after his father's outburst, it was with the intention of doing some preparation for the morrow's work at the college. But although he opened several books in turn, he could feel no quickening of knowledge in his mind. There she was again, continually recurring to his thoughts. And now she was far grander. This was the fear that had always been hidden in his heart, that somehow his friendship with Ulick was not a thing that should have happened. But he had considered it a reality he could not attempt to question. Yet he knew that but for Ulick, she must be very near to him. And Ulick had admitted his unworthiness, and so the separation was at an end. It was surprising that this should have happened now. His mind sprang back to all that tenderness with which his thoughts of her had been surrounded through these long days of dreaming, when he had contrived to meet her, as if by accident, on her way from school. All through the next day his heart was upon her. The thought of her would give peace. Into every vacant moment she would come with the full light of her presence. He had suddenly relapsed into the mood that had imprisoned him after the summer holidays. He stood aloof from Father Considine, and did not wish to see him through the whole of his long day in the college at Ballinamult. All the way home he pictured her. She was luring him now, as she had always lured him, towards a fairer vision of the valley. He noticed how the summer was again flooding over the fields, like a great river spilling wide. It was a glorious coincidence that she should be returning to him now, a creature of brightness at a time of beauty. The road seemed short this pleasant afternoon, and the customary feeling of dusty weariness was not upon him as he leapt lightly off the bicycle at his mother's door. Mrs. Brennan came out to meet him eagerly. This was no unusual occurrence, now that he had again begun to ascend the ladder of the high condition she had planned for him. She was even a far prouder woman now, for somehow she had always half remembered the stain of charity hanging over his uprise in England. Besides this, he was nearer to her, moving intimately through the valley, a living part of her justification. Her fading eyes now looked out tenderly at her son. There seemed to be a great light in them this afternoon, a great light of love for him. He was moved beneath their gaze. And still she continued to smile upon him in a weak way, as within the grip of some strong excitement. He saw when he entered that his dinner was not set out as usual on the white table in the kitchen. She brought him into the sewing room, and still she had the same smile trembling upon her lips and the same light in her eyes. All this was growing mysterious and oppressive, but his mood was proof against sad influences. It must be some tale of good fortune come to their house, of which his mother had now to tell. "Do you know what, John? The greatest thing ever is after happening." "Is that a fact, mother? Though maybe 'tis not right for me to tell you, and you all as one as a priest, I may say. But sure you're bound to hear it, and maybe a little knowledge of the kind might not be amiss even to one in your exalted station. And then to make it better, it concerns two very near friends of yours, Mr. Ulick Shannon and Miss Rebecca Kerr, I thank you." John Brennan's mind leaped immediately to interest. Were they gone back to one another? And after what he had thought today? This was the question his lips carried inwardly to himself. "I don't know how I can tell you, but Father O'Keefe was at school today in a great wet. He made a show of her before the children, Mrs. Wise and Miss McEwen, of course, giving him good help. he dismissed her and told her to go about her business. He'll maybe speak of her publicly from the altar on Sunday. And what is it, Mother? What? Oh, she's going to have a misfortune, me son. She's going to be a mother, God bless us all, and not married, or a ha'porth. Oh, God! But sure she put in for nothing else. With her going up and all that to Dublin to have her dresses made, instead of getting them done nice and quiet and modest and respectable be me. I may tell you that I was more than delighted to hear it. Well, now, and the— John was biting his lips in passion, but she took another view of it as she interrupted him. Ah, you may well ask who he is. Who but that scoundrel, Ulick Shannon, that I was never done asking you not to speak to. You were young and innocent, of course, and could not be expected to know what I know. But maybe you'll avoid him now, although I think he won't be long here, for maybe Father O'Keefe'll run him out of the parish. Maybe not, though, for his uncle has bags of money. Indeed, I wouldn't put it past him if he was the lad encouraged him to this, for the Shannons were always blackguards in their hearts. But it'll be great to hear Father O'Keefe on Sunday. I must be sure and go to his Mass. Oh, it'll be great to hear him. Yes, I suppose it will be great to hear him. John spoke out of the gathering bitterness of his heart. I wonder what'll become of her now. I wonder where she'll go. Oh, to Dublin, I suppose. She was always fond of it. His mother was in a very ecstasy of conjecture as to the probable extent of Rebecca's fate. And this was the woman who had always expressed a melting tenderness in her actions towards him. This was his mother who had spoken now, with all uncharitableness. There was such an absence of human pity in her words as most truly appalled him. Very quickly he saw, too, that it was upon his own slight connection with this tragic thing her mind was dwelling. This was to him now a token, not of love, but rather of enormous selfishness. Her eyes were upon him still, watering in admiration with a weak gleam. The four walls seemed to be moving in to crush him, after the manner of some medieval torture chamber. Within them, too, was beginning to rise a horrid stench, as of dead human beings. This ghastliness that had sprung up between mother and son seemed to have momentarily blotted out the consciousness of both. They stared at one another now with glassy, unseeing eyes. After 3, Rebecca took her lonely way from the school. Neither Mrs. Wise nor Monica McEwen had a word for her at parting. Neither this woman, who was many times a mother, nor this girl, who might yet be a mother many times. They were grinning loudly, and passing some sneer between them, as they moved away from one another alone. Down the road she went, the sunlight dazzling her tired eyes. A thought of something that had happened upon this day last year came with her remembrance of the date. It was the first anniversary of some slight, glad event that had brought her happiness. And yet, what a day it was of dire happening! Just 1 short year ago, she had not known the valley or Ulick, or this fearful thing. There were friends about her on this day last year, and the sound of laughter. And she had not been so far distant from her father's house. And, oh God, to think that now she was so much alone. Suddenly she became aware that there was someone running by her side and calling, "Miss Kerr, Miss Kerr." Oh, Janet Comiskey, she said, turning. Is it you? Yes, Miss Kerr. I want to tell you that I was talking to God last night, and I was telling him about you. He asked me did I like you, and I said I did. And so do I, said he. I like Miss Kerr very much, he said, for she's very nice, very, very nice. Rebecca had never disliked this queer child, but she loved her now, and bending down, warmly kissed her wild face. Thanks, miss. I only wanted to tell you about God, said Janet, dropping behind. Rebecca was alone again, but now she was within sight of the house of Sergeant McGoldrick. It seemed to be dozing there in the sunlight. She began to question herself. Did those within already know? Now that the full publicity of her condition seemed imminent, an extraordinary feeling of vanity was beginning to take possession of her. She took off her dust coat and hung it upon her arm. Thus uncloaked, she would face the eyes of Mrs. McGoldrick and her daughters, Euphemia and Clementina, and the eyes, very probably, of John Ross McGoldrick and Neville Chamberlain McGoldrick. But when she entered the house, she experienced the painful stillness of a tomb-like place. There was no one to be seen. She went upstairs with a kind of faltering in her limbs, but her head was erect and her fine eyes were flashing. Even still was she soaring beyond and beyond them. Her eye was caught by a note pinned upon her door. It seemed very funny, and, despite her present condition of confusion and worry, she smiled, for this was surely a melodramatic trick that Mrs. McGoldrick had acquired from the character of her reading. Still smiling, she tore it open. It read like a proclamation, and was couched in the very best handwriting of Sergeant McGoldrick. Miss Kerr, Reverend Louis O'Keefe, P.P., Garrett-Drimna, has given notice that, on account of certain deplorable circumstances, we are to refuse you permission to lodge with us any longer. This we hasten to do without any regret, considering that, to oblige you at the instigation of Father O'Keefe, we broke the regulation of the force, which forbids the keeping of lodgers by any member of that body. We hereby give you notice to be out of this house by 6 p.m. on this evening, May 19, having, it is understood, by that time, packed up your belongings and discharged your liabilities to Mrs. McGoldrick. Father O'Keefe has very magnanimously arranged that Mr. Charles Clark is to call for you with his motor and take you with all possible speed to the station at Killaconahan. Sylvester McGoldrick, Sergeant, R.I.C. The official look of the pronouncement seemed only to increase its gloomy finality, but the word magnanimously, fresh from the dictionary at the barrack, made her laugh outright. The offense she had committed was unnamed, too terrible for words. She was being sentenced like a doomed Easter rebel. Yet even still, she was not without some thought of the practical aspect of her case. She owed 30 shillings to Mrs. McGoldrick. This would leave her very little out of the few pounds she had saved from her last installment of salary, with which to face the world. This, of course, if Ulick did not come. And here was her dinner, set untidily in the stuffy room where the window had not been opened since the time she had left it this morning in confusion. And the whole house was quiet as the grave. She never remembered to have heard it so quiet at any other time. It seemed as if this silence had been designed with a studied calculation of the pain it would cause. There was no kindness in this woman either, although she too was a mother and had young daughters. It appeared so greatly uncharitable that in these last terrible moments she could not cast from her the small and pitiful enmity she had begun upon the evening of Rebecca's arrival in the valley. She would not come even now and help her pack up her things, and she so weary? But it was easily done. The few articles that had augmented her wardrobe since her coming to the valley would go into the basket she had used to carry those which were barely necessary for her comfort when she went to that lonely cottage in Donegal. The mean room was still bare as when she had first come to it. She had not attempted to decorate it. In a pile in one corner stood the full series of Irish school weeklies and Weldon's Ladies' Journals she had purchased since her coming here. She had little use for either of these publications now. Little use for the one that related to education, or the other that related to adornment. There came a feverish haste upon her to get done with the preparations for departure, and soon they were completed. She had her trunk corded and all ready. She had no doubt that Ulick would meet her upon the road of the dead at 5:30, the hour she had named in the letter of this morning. It was lucky she had so accurately guessed her possible time of departure, although somehow she had had no notion this morning of leaving so soon. But already it was more than 4:30 by her little wristlet watch. She put on her best dress, which had been left out on the bed, and redid her hair. It was still a certain salvage from the wreck she was becoming. Ulick or any other man, for all he had ruined her, must still love her for that hair of gold. It needed no crown at all, but a woman's vanity was still hers, and she put on a pretty hat, which Ulick had fancied in Dublin. She had worn it for the first time last summer in Donegal, and it became her better than any hat she had ever worn. What would they say if they saw her moving about in this guise, so brazenly as it seemed, when she might be spoken of from the altar on Sunday? Now fell upon her a melancholy desire to see the chapel. There was yet time to go there and pray just as she had thought of praying on her first evening on coming to Garrett-Drimnagh. She took a final glance at the little mean room. It had not been a room of mirth for her, and she was not sorry to leave it. There was the corded trunk to tell the tale of its inhospitality. She took the money from Mrs. McGoldrick from her purse and put it into an envelope. Going downstairs, she left it upon the kitchen table. There was no one to be seen, but she could hear the scurrying of small feet from her, as if she were some monstrous and forbidden thing. As she went up the bright road, there was a flickering consciousness in her breast that she was an offense against the sunlight, but this feeling fled away from her when she went into the chapel and knelt down to pray. Her mind was full of her purpose, and she did not experience the distraction of one single selfish thought. But when she put her hands up to her face in an attitude of piety, she felt that her face was burning. It was a day for confessions, but there were few people in the chapel, and those not approaching the confessionals. The two young curates, Father Ford and Father Fagin, were moving about the quiet aisles, each deeply intent upon the reading of his office. They were nearer the altar than to her, but for all the air of piety in which they seemed to be enveloped, they detected her presence immediately and simultaneously. Soon they began to extend their back and forward pacing to include her within the range of their sidelong vision. By the time she had got halfway around her little mother-of-pearl rosary, they were moving past her and towards one another at her back. She was saying her poor prayers as well as she could, but there they were with their heads working up and down as they looked alternately at her and at their holy books. Just as she got to the end of the last decade, she was conscious that they had come together and were whispering behind her. It was not until then that she saw the chapel for what it stood in regard to her. It was the place where on Sunday next, mean people would smirk in satisfaction as they sat listening in all their lack of charity and fullness of pride. The realization brought the pulsing surge of anger to her blood, and she rose to come away. But when she turned around abruptly, there were the two curates with their eyes still fixed upon her. She did not meet their looks full straight, for they turned away as if to avoid the contamination of her, as she ran from the house of God. When John Brennan reached a point in his disgust where further endurance was impossible, he broke away from the house and from his mother. He went out wildly through the green fields. But he would see her. He would go to her, for surely she had need of him now. If Ulick did not come, and there was much in his manner and conversation of the previous night to make it doubtful. If he did not take her away from this place and make her his own to protect and cherish, there was only one course left open. He knew little of these things, for he knew little of the ways of life. But instinctively he felt that Rebecca would now cling to Ulick, and that Ulick would be a great scoundrel if he spurned her from him. And what, he asked himself, would he, John Brennan, do in that case? No answer would spring directly to his thoughts, but some ancient, primeval feeling was stirring in his heart. The answer that men have held to be the only answer from the beginning of the world. But that was a dreadful thing, which in its eddying circles of horror might compass his own end also. But maybe the whole story was untrue. He had heard his mother speak many a time after the same fashion, and there was never one case of the kind but had proved untrue. Yet it was terrible that no answer would come flashing out of his wild thoughts, and already he had reached the road of the dead. His wandering eyes had at last begun to rest upon a wide green field. He saw the wind and sun conspiring to ripple the grass into the loveliest little waves. He had loved this always, and even the present state of his mind did not refuse the sensation of its beauty. He went and leaned across the field gate to gaze upon it. He turned suddenly, for there was a step approaching him along the road. Yes, surely it was she. It was Rebecca Kerr herself, coming towards him down the road of the dead. She was smiling, but from the dark red shadows about her eyes, it was easy to see that she had quite recently been crying. "Good evening, John Brennan," she said. "Good evening, Miss Kerr." There was a deep touch of concern turning to anxiety, almost a rich tenderness in his words. She heard them for what they were, and there came to her clearly their accents of pity. For the moment neither seemed capable of finding speech. Her eyes were searching the road of the dead for the man she expected to meet her here. But he was not coming. In the silence that had fallen between them, John Brennan had clearly glimpsed the dumb longing that was upon her. He felt the final gloom that was moving in around her, yet he could not find speech. "I'm going away from the valley," said Rebecca. He made some noise in his throat, but she could hear no distinct word. "It was not you I expected to meet here this evening. It is so strange how we have met like this." "I just came out for a walk," he stammered, at a loss for something better to say. "I'm glad we have met," she said, "for this is the last time." It was easy to see that her words held much meaning for herself and him. He seemed to be nearer the brink as her eyes turned from him again to search the road. "He will not come," she said, and there was a kind of wretched recklessness in her tones. "I know he will not come, for that possibility has never been." She grew more resigned of a sudden. She saw that John Brennan, too, was searching the road with his eyes. Then he knew the reason she was going away. He was such a nice boy, and between his anxious watching now for her sake, he was gazing with pity into her eyes. He must know Ulick, too, as a man knows his friend, and that Ulick would not come to her in this her hour of trial. The knowledge seemed the more terrible, since it was through John Brennan it had come. And yet it was less terrible, since he did not disdain her for what she had done. She saw through his excuse. He had come this way with the special purpose of seeing her, and if he had not met her thus accidentally, he must inevitably have called at the house of Sergeant McGoldrick to extend his farewell. She was glad that she had saved him this indignity by coming out to her own disappointment. She was sorry that he had again returned to his accustomed way of thinking of her, that he had again departed from the way into which she had attempted to direct him. And now there loomed up for her great terror in this thought. Yet she could read it very clearly in the way he was looking so friendly upon her. Why had he always looked upon her in this way? Surely she had never desired it. She had never desired him. It was Ulick she had longed for always. It was Ulick she had longed for this evening. And it was John Brennan who had come. Yes, how well he had come. It was very simple and very beautiful, this action of his, but in its simple goodness there was a fair promise of its high desolation. It appeared that she stood for his ruin also, and even now, in the mounting moments of her fear, this appeared as an ending far more appalling. She was coming to look at her own fate as a thing she might be able to bear, but there was something so vastly filled with torture in this thought. Whenever she would look into the eyes of the child and make plans for its little future, she would think of John Brennan and what had happened to him. She felt that they had been a long time standing here at this gate, by turns gazing anxiously up and down the road, by turns looking vacantly out over the sea of grass. Time was of more account than ever before. For was it not upon this very evening that she was being banished from the valley? "I must go now," she said. "He will never come." He did not answer, but moved as if to accompany her. She grew annoyed as she observed his action. "No, no, you must not come with me now. You must not speak with me again. I have placed myself forever beyond your friendship or your thought." As she extended her hand to him, her heart was moved by 1,000 impulses. "Good-bye, John Brennan," she said simply. "Good-bye, Rebecca," said he at last, finding speech by a tremendous effort, and without another word they parted there on the road of the dead. Outside the garden gate of Sergeant McGoldrick, Charlie Clark was waiting for her with his motor car. Her trunk had been put in at the back. This was an unholy job for a saintly chauffeur. But it was Father O'Keefe's command, and his will must be done. When the news of it had been communicated to him, he had said a memorable thing. "Well, now, the quare jobs a religious man has sometimes to do, but maybe these little punishments are by way of satisfaction for some forgotten and far distant sin." Rebecca understood his anxiety to have her off his hands, as she saw him jump in behind the wheel at her approach. She got in beside her poor trunk, and presently the car would be ready to start. There was not a trace of any of the McGoldrick family to be seen, but there was a sudden breaking through the green hedge upon the other side of the road, and Janet Comiskey stood beside the car. Rebecca was surprised by the sudden appearance of the little mad girl at this moment. "Miss Kerr, Miss Kerr," she called, "I got this from God. God told me to give you this." The car started away, and Rebecca saw that the superscription on the letter she had been handed was in the pronounced Vere Foster style of Master Donnellan. Doubtless it was some long-winded message of farewell from the kind-hearted master, and she would not open it now. It would be something to read as she moved away towards Dublin. Just now her eyes were being filled by the receding pageant of the valley, that place of all earth's places which had so powerfully arrayed its villainy against her. And to think that he had not come. It was the valley of Hinnom. Yes, to think that he had not come after all she had been to him, after all the love of her heart she had given him. No word could ever pass between them again. They were upon the very brink of the eternity of separation. She knew now that for all the glory in which she had once beheld him, he must shrivel down to the bitter compass of a little painful memory. Oh God! To think he had not replied to her letter, and the writing of it had given her such pain. They were at the station of Killiconahan. Charlie Clark had not spoken all through the journey, but now he came up to her indignantly, as if very vexed for being compelled to speak to her at all, and said, "The fare is £1." The word smote her with a little sense of shock. She had been expecting something by way of climax. She was very certain in her consciousness that the valley would not let her slip thus quietly away. £1 for the journey. Although it was Father O'Keefe who had engaged the car, she must pay this religious robber a huge price for the drive. There rushed through her mind momentarily a mad flash of rebellion. The valley was carrying its tyranny a little too far. She would not pay. But almost immediately she was searching for a note in her purse. There were so very few of them now, yet she could not leave the valley with any further little stain upon her. They would talk of a thing like this for years and years. With a deadly silence hanging over him, and fearful thoughts coming into his mind, Miles Shannon had kept himself and his nephew Ulick at work all through the day. After tea in the lonely dining-room, he fetched in his inky account books, which had been neglected for many a month. His nephew would here have work to occupy him for the remainder of the evening and probably far into the night. Ulick was glad of the task, for his mind was very far from being at ease. Then Mr. Shannon took £100 from the old-fashioned bureau in the parlor, which held with the other things all his papers and accounts, and, while the evening was yet high, went down towards the house of Sergeant McGoldrick to see Rebecca Kerr. Around the bend of the road he encountered Charlie Clark on his way back from Killiconahan, where he had been delayed upon bazaar business. The saintly chauffeur at once put on the brakes. This was Mr. Miles Shannon, and someone worth speaking to. He bowed a groveling salute. "You're out pretty late," said Mr. Shannon. "Oh, yes." And then he went on to describe his work of the evening. He felt inclined to offer his condolence to Mr. Shannon in a most respectful whisper, but thought better of it at the last moment. "And no one knows where she has gone?" "No one. She has disappeared from the valley." "She went away very suddenly." "Yes, Father O'Keefe saw that, in the public interest, she should disappear after this fashion. The motor was a help, you know." Charlie Clark offered to drive Mr. Shannon to his home. No word passed between them as they drew up the avenue to the lonely house among the trees. In the train moving on towards Dublin, Rebecca Kerr had just opened a letter from Master Dinellan. It contained a £5 note. This was like a cry of mercy and pardon for the valley. The rich fields of Meath were racing by. End of Chapter 30. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 31 of The Valley of the Squinting Windows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Valley of the Squinting Windows by Brinsley MacNamara. Chapter 31. There was a curious hush about the lake next evening, although the little cottage of Hughie Murtaugh was swept by winds which stirred mournfully through all the bright abundance of early summer. Even the orange blossoms of the firs seemed to put on an aspect of surrender. There was no challenge in their color now. They looked almost white against a somber sunset. John Brennan moped about among the fir trees. He came to a standstill by one that had begun to decay, and which was even more mournful in its failure to contribute another plumed head to the general effect of mourning. But it seemed to shake enraged at this impotence in its poor foundation over the deserted warren, from which Seamus Gallagher had long since driven the little rabbits toward the dark Chicago of slaughter, which was represented to them by Garadrimna. The same color of desolation was upon the reeds which separated him from the water. The water itself had beneath its pretense of brightness upon the surface the appearance of ooze, as if it had come washing over the slime of dead things. It was here that John Brennan had come to wait for Ulick Shannon, and as he waited, his mood became that of his surroundings. He fell to running over what had happened to him. Alternately, in the swirl of his consciousness, it appeared as the power of the valley and as the hand of God. Yet whatever it might be, in truth, this much was certain. It had reduced his life to ruins. It was a fearful thing, and he shuddered a little when he endeavored to produce a clear picture of it for the chastisement as well as the morbid excitement of his imagination. But there came instead a far different picture, which seemed to have the effect of lifting for a moment the surrounding gloom. He saw Rebecca Kerr again, as upon many an afternoon they had met. For one brave moment he strove to recover the fine feeling that had filled him at those times. But it would not come. Something had happened, something terrible, which soiled and spoiled her forever. For love of her he had dreamed even into the desire of defeating his mother's love. And yet there was no triumph in his heart now, nothing save defeat and a great weariness. Neither his mother nor Rebecca Kerr were any longer definite hopes upon which his mind might dwell. His thoughts were running altogether upon Ulick Shannon. It was for Ulick he waited now in this lonely, wind-swept place. like any villain he had ever seen depicted upon the cover of a penny dreadful in Phillips's window when he was a boy. He now saw himself fixed in his own imagination after this fashion. Ulick Shannon would soon come. There was no doubt of this, for a definite appointment had been made during the day. He had remained at home from the College of Ballinamult to bring it about. Soon they would be endeavoring to enter what must be the final and tragic byway of their story. And it must be all so dreadfully interesting, this ending he had planned. Now the water came flowing towards him more rapidly, as if to hurry the tragedy. It came more thickly and muddily, with long billowy strides, as if it yearned to gather some other body still holding life to its wild breast. Its waters kept flowing, as if from some wide wound that ached and would not be satisfied, that bled and called aloud for blood forever. Now also the evening shadows were beginning to creep down the hills, and with them a deeper hush was coming upon the wild longing of all things. Yet it was no hush of peace, but rather the concentration of some horrible purpose upon one place. "I'm going away on Friday," Ulick had written in one of the 2 notes that had been exchanged between them by the messenger during the day, "and I would like to see you for what must unfortunately be the last time. I am slipping away unknown to my uncle or to anyone, and it is hardly probable that I will be seen in these parts again." At length he beheld the approach of Ulick down the long hill of Annis. His spirit thrilled within him, and flamed again into a white flame of love for the girl who was gone. And coming hither was the man who had done this thing. The thickest shadows of the evening would soon be gathered closely about the scene they were to witness. The very reeds were rustling now in dread. The lake was deep here at the edge of the water, and in the rabbit warren beneath his feet were the heavy pieces of lead piping he had transported in the night. He had taken them from his father's stock of plumber's materials, that mouldy, unused stock, which had so long lain in the backyard, and which in a distant way possessed an intimate connection with this heaped-up story. In a little instant of peculiar consciousness, he wondered whether it would be pliable enough. There were pieces for the legs and pieces for the arms, which would enfold those members as in a weighty coffin, and hidden nearer to his hand was the strangely shaped, uncouth weapon his father had used many a time with such lack of improvement upon the school slates, and with which one might kill a man. The body would rest well down there beneath the muddy waters. There would be no possibility of suspicion falling upon him, for the story of Rebecca Kerr's disgrace and Ulick Shannon's connection with it had already got about the valley. He had been listening to his mother telling it to people all day. Ulick's disappearance, in a way self-effacing and unnamed, was hourly expected. This opportunity appeared the one kind trick of fate, which had been so unkind to the passionate yearnings of John Brennan. But Ulick Shannon was by his side, and they were talking again as friends of different things in the light way of old. Their talk moved not at all within the shadows of things about to happen presently, but the shadows were closing in, and very soon they must fall, and lie heavily upon all things here by the lake. "Isn't it rather wonderful, Brennan, that I should be going hence through the power of a woman? It is very strange how they always manage to have their revenge, how they beat us in the long run, no matter how we may plume ourselves on a triumph that we merely fancy. Although we may degrade and rob them of their treasure, ours is the final punishment. Do you remember how I told you on that day we were at the North Leinster Arms in Ballinamult There was no trusting any woman, not even your own mother. Now this Rebecca Kerr, she. The sentence was never finished. John Brennan had not spoken, but his hand had moved twice, to lift the uncouth weapon from the foot of the tree, and again to strike the blow. The mold of unhappy clay from which the words of Ulick had just come was stilled forever. The great cry which struggled to break from the lips resulted only in a long-drawn sigh. It was like a queer swoon. The mournful screech of a wild bird flying low over the lake drowned the little gust of sound. Then the last lone silence fell between the two young men who had once been most dear companions. No qualms of any kind came to the breast of John Brennan. He had hardened his heart between the leaping flames of love and hate, and there was upon him now the feeling of one who has done a fine thing. He was in the moment of his triumph, yet he was beginning to be amazed by his sudden power and the result of his decision, that he, John Brennan, should have had it in him to murder his friend. But no, it was his enemy he had murdered, the man who had desecrated the beauty of the world. And there was a rare grandeur in what he had done. It was a thing of beauty snatched from the red hands of death. Yet as he went about his preparations for submerging the body, he felt something akin to disgust for this the mean business of the murder. Here was where the beauty that had been his deed snapped finally from existence in his consciousness and disappeared from him. Henceforth, grey thought after grey thought came tumbling into his mind. Ulick had not been a bad fellow. He had tried to be kind to him. All the motor drives and the walks and talks they had had, even the bits of days and nights spent together in Garrodrimna. And how was Ulick to know of his affection for Rebecca Kerr? There had never been the faintest statement of the fact between them. His whole manner and conversation, and the end for which he was intended, forbade any suspicion of the kind. In fact, to have had such a doubt would have been a sin in the eyes of many a Catholic. The legs and arms were well weighted now. This might not have happened if his mother had been attended in the right spirit of filial obedience, but with the arrogance of youth, which he now realized for the first time, he had placed himself above her opinion and done what he had desired at the moment. And why had he done so? She would seem to have had foreboding of all this in the way she had looked upon him so tenderly with her tired eyes many a time since his memorable homecoming last summer. She had always been so fearfully anxious. Here must have been the melancholy end she had seen at the back of all dreaming. He could feel that sad look clearly, all dimmed by dark presentiments. The body was a great weight. He strove to lift it in his arms in such a way that his clothes might not be soiled by the blood. His face was very near the pale, dead face, with the red blood now clotting amongst the hair. He was almost overpowered by his burden as he dragged it to the water's edge. It was a very fearful thing to look at, just as the water closed over it with a low, gurgling sound, as if of mourning, like the cry of the bird in the moment the murder had been done. As he staggered back from the sighing reeds, he noticed that the ground was blood-drenched beneath the tree. But he was doing the thing most thoroughly. In a frenzy of precautionary industry, he began to hack away the earth with the slating implement, very much as Shamosie Gallagher might hack it in search of a rabbit. Later, he seemed to put on the very appearance of Shamosie himself, as with bent body he slouched away across the ridge of the world. He, too, had just effected a piece of slaughter, and Garrodrimna seemed to call him. End of chapter 31. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 32 of The Valley of the Squinting Windows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Valley of the Squinting Windows by Brinsley MacNamara. Chapter 32. When he came out upon the valley road, he was no longer the admirable young man he had been less than a year since. He was a broken thing, and he was stained by another's blood. He was marked eternally by what he had done, and there was upon him a degradation unspeakable. He was an offense against existence and against the gathering, blessed gloom of the quiet evening. He had murdered one who had been his friend, and it was a thing he might never be able to forget. The body with all the lovely life so recently gone from it, he had waited and sunk beneath the surface of the lake. It was down there now, a poor dead thing, among the ooze of dead things from which the water had taken its color and quality. The wild spirit that had been Ulick Shannon, so contradictory in its many aspects, was now soaring lightly aloft upon the wings of clean winds, and he, John Brennan, who had effected this grand release, felt the weights still heavy about his heart. He came on a group of children playing by the roadside. It seemed as if they had been driven across his path to thwart him with their innocence. He instantly remembered that other evening, when he had been pained to hear them express the ugly, uncharitable notions of their parents regarding a child of another religion. Now they were playing merrily as God had intended them to play, and religion, with its tyranny of compulsion towards thoughts of death and sin, seemed distant from them, and distant was it from him, too. His mind was empty of any thought. Would no kindly piece of imagination come down to cool his spirit with its grace, or lift from his heart the oppression of the leaden weights he had bound about the body of Ulick Shannon? At last he had remembrance of his mother. It had been borne in upon him during some of his lonely cycle rides to and from Ballinamult that things should not be somehow as they were. He was moving along exalted ways, while his mother labored in lonely silence at her machine. Where was the money coming from? Such an unproductive state as his required money for its upkeep. His father was no toiler, but she was always working there alone in the lonely room. Her hands were grown gnarled and hard through her years of labor. Just presently she was probably discussing a dismal matter of ways and means with some woman of the valley, saying as she had said through the long years, "Thank God and His blessed Mother this night, I still have me hands. Aye, that's what I was just saying to Mrs. So-and-so this morning. Thank God, I still have me hands." Thus she was going on now, he imagined, as he had always heard her, a pathetic figure sitting there and looking painfully through the heavy, permanent mist that was falling down upon her eyes. And yet it was not thus she really was at this moment. For although it was a woman who held her company, there was no mood of peace between them. It was Marse Prendergast who was with her, and she was proceeding busily with her eternal whine. Mrs. Brennan was now disturbed in her mind and fearful of the great calamity that might happen. While she had bravely maintained the money in the little chest upstairs, there had lingered, in spite of every affliction, a sense of quietness and independence. But now she was without help, and as one distraught. Of late this gibbering old woman had obtained a certain power over her, and a considerable portion of the once proud Mrs. Brennan had fallen finally away. Although at unaccountable moments her strong pride would spring up to dazzle the people of the valley, she did not now possess that remarkable imperviousness which had so distinguished her attitude towards life. Now she was in a condition of disintegration, unable to maintain an antagonism or hide a purpose. The old ruined woman, the broken shoiler of the roads, was beginning to behold the ruins of another woman, the ruins of Mrs. Brennan, who had once been so thick and proud. "So you won't hearken to me request?" "I can't, Mars, dear. I have no money to give you." This was a true word, for the little store upstairs had gone this way and that. Tommy Williams had to be given his interest, and although people might think that John was getting his education for charity, no one knew better than she the heavy fees of the college in Ballinamult. Besides, he must keep up a good appearance in the valley. But when Mars Prendergast made a demand, she knew no reason and could make no allowance. "Well, Nan, me dear, I must do me duty. I must speak out when you can't bribe me to be silent. I must do a horrid piece of business this night. I must turn a son against his mother. Yes, that must be the way of it now. A son turned for good against his mother. For surely there could be no pardon in his grand holy eyes for what you were once upon a time. But let me tell you this, that I'd have acquainted him anyhow, for I'd not have gone to me grave with that sin on me no matter what. They say it isn't right to offer a son to God where there's after being any big blemish in the family, and that if you do a woeful misfortune or a black curse comes of it. And sure that was the quare big blemish in your family, Nan Byrne, the queerest blemish ever was." Mrs. Brennan began to cry. She seemed to have come at last to the end of all her long attempt to brazen things out. Mars Prendergast was not slow to observe this acceptance of defeat, and saw that now surely was her time to be hard and bitter. She was growing so old, a withered stump upon the brink of years, and there was upon her an enormous craving for a little money. People were even driven by her constant whine for this thing and that, to say how she had a little store of her own laid by, which she gloated over with a wicked and senile delight. And for what in God's name was she hoarding, and she an old lone woman with the life just crosswise in her? And it was always Mrs. Brennan whom she had visited with her singular and special persecution. "I suppose, now, you think you're the quare clever one to be going on with your refusals from day to day. I suppose you think I don't know that you have a chest full of money that you robbed from poor Henry Shannon, God be good to him, when he used to be comin' running to see you, the foolish fellow. As God's me judge, Mars Prendergast, I haven't e'er a penny in the house. I'm in debt in Garradrimna this blessed minute, and that's as sure as you're there." "Go on out of that with your talk of debts, and you to be sending your son John through his college courses before all our eyes like any fine lady in the land. And think of all the grand money you'll be getting by and by, in rolls and cartloads. Aye, with the help of God." Even in the moment of her torment, Mrs. Brennan could not restrain her vanity of her son. "And to think of all that being before you now, and still you keep up your mean refusals of the little thing I ask," said the old woman with the pertinacious unreasonableness of age. "I haven't got the money, Mars. God knows I haven't." "God knows nothing, Nan Burn, only your shocking villainy. And 'tis the great sin for you, surely. And if God knows this, it is for some one else to know your sin. It is for your son John to know the kind of a mother that he loves and honors." Mrs. Brennan had heard this threat on many an occasion, yet even now the repetition of it made her grow suddenly pale. An expression of sickliness was upon her face, seen even through the shadowed sewing-room. Always this thought had haunted her, that sometime John might come to know. "Long threatening comes at last," was a phrase that had always held for her the darkest meaning. She could never listen to any woman make use of it without shuddering violently. Mars Prendergast had threatened so often and often. "And no, Nan Burn, this is something I could never let pass. And all the long days I saw you contriving here at the machine, and you so anxious and attentive. Sure, I used to be grinning to myself at the thoughts of the bloody fine laugh I'd be having at you some day. I used, that's God's truth." It seemed terrible to be told the story of this hate that had been so well hidden, now springing up before her in a withering blast of ingratitude and being borne to her understanding upon such quiet words. She sighed ever so slightly, and her lips moved gently in the aspiration of a prayer. "Oh, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," was what she said. The pious ejaculation seemed to leap at once towards the accomplishment of a definite purpose, for immediately it had the effect of moving Mars Prendergast towards the door. "I'm going now." The words were spoken with an even more chilling quietness. Mrs. Brennan made a noise as if to articulate something, but no words would come from her. "And let you not be thinking that 'tis only this little thing I'm going to tell him, for there's a whole lot more. I'm going to tell him all I know, all that I didn't tell you through the length of the years, though, God knows, it has been often burning me to tell. You think, I suppose, as clever as you are, that the child was buried in the garden. Well, that's not a fact, nor the color of a fact, for all I've made you afraid of it so often. Grace Gogarty had no child of her own for Henry Shannon. Ulick Shannon is your own child, that was sold be your old mother for a few pound. That's a lie for you, Mars Prendergast. 'Tis no lie at all, I'm telling you, but the naked truth. I suppose neither of them lads, Ulick nor John, ever guessed the reason why they were so fond of one another. But that was the reason, and 'tis I used to enjoy seeing them together and knowing it well. Isn't it curious now to say that you're the mother of a blackguard and the mother of the makings of a priest? Maybe you'd give me a little bit of money now, maybe." Mrs. Brennan did not answer. Big tears were rolling down her cheeks one after the other. Her heart had been rent by the sudden flash of information. Even the last remaining stronghold of her vanity had been swept away. That she, who had claim, in her own estimation, to be considered the wise woman of the valley, could not have long since guessed at the existence of a fact so intimate. Her heart was wounded, not unto death, but immortally. Her son, Ulick Shannon, her son, O Mother of God! John Brennan was still in his agony as he saw the long-tongued Schuyler coming towards him down the road. She was making little journeys into the ditches as she came along. She was gathering material for a fire, although every bush was green. She was always shivering at the fall of night, The appearance of the children had filled him with speculations as to where he might look for some comfort. Could it be derived from the precepts of religion, translated into acts of human kindness? Momentarily he was confused as he attempted to realize some act of goodness to be done here and now. He was unable to see. Old Mars Prendergast, coming towards him slowly, was the solitary link connecting his mind with any thought. To him she appeared the poor old woman in need of pity who was gathering green sticks from the hedgerows to make her fire, which would not kindle. He remembered that morning, now some time distant, when he had helped her carry home a bundle of her sticks on his way from Mass. It had appeared to him then, as it did now, a Christ-like action. But his mother had rebuked him for it. Yet he had always wished his mother to take the place of Mary when he tried to snatch some comfort from the gospel story. Soon he was by her side, speaking as kindly as he could. Great fear was already upon him. "God bless you, me little Johnine, me little son. Sure 'tis yourself has the dacent, kind heart to be taking pity upon the old. Arrah now, you're alone and lonely this evening, I notice, for your friend is gone from you. It bees lonely when one loses one's comrade. Ah, 'tis many a year and more since I lost me comrade through the valley of life. Since Marks Prendergast, the good husband of me heart, and the father of me children, was lost on me. Sure he was murdered on me one St. Patrick's Day fair in Garadrimna. He was ripped open with a knife and left there upon the street in his blood for me to see. That's the way, me sweet gossoon. Some die clean and quiet, and some go away in their blood like the way they came." Had she devoted much time and skill to it, she could not have produced a more dire effect upon John than by this accidental turn of her talk. The scene by the lakeside swam clearly into his eyes again. "I suppose your good comrade is gone away?" "Whom? What?" "Ulick Shannon, to be sure. I suppose he's after slipping away, be this time, anyway." "Aye, he's gone away. That was what you might call the nice lad, and it was no wonder at all that you were so much attached to one another. Never a bit of wonder at all. Sure, you were like brothers." John was so solicitous in maintaining his silence that he did not notice the old woman's terrible sententiousness. He went on pulling green sticks from the hedge, and placing them very carefully by the side of those she had already gathered. "Just like brothers. That's what ye were, just like brothers. He, he, he." Although he did not detect the note of laughter in it that was hollow and a mockery, he was nevertheless appalled by what should appear as a commendation of him who was gone. He felt himself shaking even as the leaves in the hedgerows were being shaken by the light wind of evening. "Like brothers, Vic Macree." Even still he did not reply. "Like brothers, I say, and that's the whole story, for ye were brothers. At least you were of the one blood, because ye had the same woman for the mother of ye both." Certainly she was raving, but her words were having an unusual effect upon him. He was keeping closer to the hedge, as if trying to hide his face. "Tonight, me fine gossoon, I'm going to do a terrible thing. I'm going to tell you who your mother is, and then you'll know a quare story. You'll know that Ulick Shannon, good luck to him wherever he's gone, was nothing less than your own brother. It is she that is after forcing me onto it, be her penurious and miserly ways. I didn't want to tell ye, John. I say, I didn't want to tell ye." Her old, cracked voice trailed away into a high screech. John Brennan was like a man stunned by a blow as he waited for her to speak the rest of the story. Ulick Shannon's father, Henry Shannon, was the one your mother loved. She never cared for your father, nor he for her. So you might say you are no love child. But there was a love child in it, to be sure, and that child was Ulick Shannon. Your mother was his mother. He was born out of wedlock, surely, but he happened handy, and was put in the place of Grace Gogarty's child that died, and it a weeshy young thing. It was your grandmother that sold him. God forgive her, if you want to know, for I was watching the deed being done. Your mother always thought the bastard was murdered in the house and buried in the garden. I used to be forever tormenting her by making her think that only it was me could tell. There was no one knew it for certain in the whole world, only me, and them that were dead and gone. So your mother could not have found out from any one but me, and she might never have found out, only for the way she used to be refusing me of a little dues. But I can tell you that she found out this evening how she was the mother of Ulick Shannon, and that you, the beloved son she cherished in her heart, and put on in all her pride to be a priest of God, was a near blood relation of the boy she was never done but running down, the boy that she, above all others, with her prate and gab, made a drunkard of in the first place, and then rushed on, be always talking of the like about him, to do great harm to this girl. But sure it was myself that could not blame him at all, for it was in him both ways, the poor unfortunate gossoon. There was no reason to doubt the old Schuyler's story. With such passionate vehemence did it fall from her, and its coherence was very convincing. It struck him as a greater blow, which almost obliterated his understanding. In the first moment he could stand apart from it and look even blindly. It appeared as the swift descent of divine vengeance upon him for what he had just done. He moved away, his mind a bursting tumult, and without a sight in his eyes. The mocking laughter of Mars Prendergast rang in his ears. Now why was she laughing at him when it was his mother who was her enemy? He was walking, but the action was almost unnoticed by him. He was moving aimlessly within the dark encircling shadow of his doom. Yet he saw that he was not far distant from Garadrimna. The last time he had been there at the period of the day, he had been in company with Ulick Shannon. It was what had sprung out of those comings together that was now responsible for his red ending. He remembered also how the port wine had lifted him out of himself and helped him to see Rebecca Kerr. The windows were squinting through the gloom as he went the road. There was stronger drink in Garadrimna, and pubs of greater intensity than McDermott's. There was the World's End, for instance, that tavern so fantastically named by the Honourable Reginald Moore, in memory of an inn of the same name that had struck his fancy in England. The title now seemed particularly appropriate. It was towards this place his feet were moving. In another spell of thought, which surprised him by the precaution it exhibited, He remembered that his father would not be there, for although it had been Ned Brennan's famous haunt aforetime, he had been long ago forbidden its doors. It was in this, one of the 7 places of degradation in Garadrimna, he was now due to appear. He went very timidly up to the back door, which opened upon a little secluded passage. He ordered a glass of whiskey from the greasy barmaid who came to attend him. He felt for the money so carefully wrapped in tissue paper in his waistcoat pocket. It was a bright gold sovereign that his mother had given him on the first day of his course at Ballinamult College, to keep against any time he might be called upon to show off the fact that he was a gentleman. As he unfolded it now from the careful covering in which he had wrapped it, it seemed to put on a tragic significance. He was fearfully anxious to be in the condition that had brought him his vision on the night he had slept by the lake. He drank the whiskey in one gulp, and it seemed a long time until the barmaid returned with the change. Sovereigns were marvels of rare appearance at the world's end. He thanked her and called for another, paying her as he went. She was remarkably mannerly, for in the narrow gloom of the place, she took him to be some rich stranger. She had seen the color of his money and liked it well. The whiskey seemed to possess magical powers. It rapidly restored him to a mood wherein the distress that was his might soon appear a small thing. Yet he grew restless with the urgency that was upon him, and glanced around in search of a distraction for his galloping brain. He bent down and peered through the little aperture which opened upon the public bar of the World's End. In there he saw a man in a heated atmosphere, and enveloped by dense clouds of tobacco smoke. They were those who had come in the roads to forget their sweat and labor in the black joy of porter. Theirs was a part of the tragedy of the fields, but it was a meaner tragedy. Yet were they suddenly akin to him. Through the lugubrious expression of their dark faces, a sudden light was shining. It was the light as if of some ecstasy. A desire fell upon him to enter into their dream, whatever it might be. In the wild whirl that the whiskey had whipped up in his brain, there now came a sudden lull. It was a lull after a great crescendo, as in Beethoven's music. He was hearing with extraordinary clearness what they were saying. They were speaking of the case of Ulick Shannon and Rebecca Kerr. These names are linked inseparably, and were going hand in hand down all the byways of their talk. They were sure and certain that he had gone away. There was not a sign of him in Garadrimna this evening. That put the cap on his guilt, surely. Wasn't she the grand whipster, and she supposed to be showing a good example and teaching religion to the childer? A nice one to have in the parish, indeed. It was easy knowing from the beginning what she was, and the fellow she struck up with, Henry Shannon's son. Wasn't that enough for you? Henry Shannon, who was the best blackguard of his time. Just inside and very near to John, a knot of men were discussing the more striking aspects of the powerful scandal. They were recounting with minute detail the story of Nan Byrne. Wasn't it the strangest thing now, how she had managed more or less to live it down? But people would remember it all again in the light of this thing. What Ulick Shannon had done now would make people think of what his father had done, and then they must needs remember her. And to think that no one ever knew rightly what had become of the child. Some there were who would tell you that her sister, Bridget Mulvey, and her mother, Abigail Byrne, buried it in the garden. And there were those who would tell you that it was living somewhere at the present time. Her son John was not a bad sort, but wasn't it the greatest crime for her to put him on to be a priest, after what had happened to her? And surely no good could come of it. And why wouldn't Ned Brennan know of it? And wasn't it that, and nothing else, that had made him the ruined wreck of a man he was? Sure, he'd never done a day's good since the night Larry Cully had lashed out the whole story for his benefit. And wasn't it quite possible that someone would be bad enough to tell John himself sometime, or the ecclesiastical authorities? What about the meaw that had happened to him in the Grand College in England, that so much had been heard of? And there was sure to be something else happening before he was through the college at Ballinamult. A priest, how are ye? The whiskey had gone to his head, but as he listened, John Brennan felt himself grow more sober than he had ever before been. So this was the supplement to the story he had heard a while ago, and now that he knew the whole story, he began to tremble. Continually flashing across his mind were the words of the man who was dead and silent at the bottom of the lake. You could never know a woman. You could never trust her. You could not even trust your own mother. This was a hard thing for any man at all to have said in his lifetime, and yet how full of grim, sad truth did it now appear. The kind forgetfulness of his choking bitterness that he had so passionately longed for would not come to him. The dregs of his heart were beginning to turn again towards thoughts of magnanimity, as they had already done in the first clear spell of thought after his deed. He had then gone to gather sticks for the old woman, a kind thing, as Jesus might have done in Nazareth. The change of the sovereign was in his hand, and his impulse was strong upon him. He could not resist. It seemed as if a strong magnet was pulling a light piece of steel. He had walked into the public bar of the World's End. Around him was a sea of faces, laughing, sneering, drinking, sweating, swearing, spitting. He was calling for a drink for himself and a round for the shop. Now the sea of faces was becoming as one face, and there was a look upon it which seemed made up of incredulity and contempt. This was replaced by a different look when the pints were in their hands. They were saying, "Good health, Mr. Brennan," with a sneer in their tones and a smile of flattery upon those lips, which had just now been vomiting out the slime of their minds. There was another and yet another round. As long as he could remain on his feet, he remained standing drinks to them. There was a longing upon him to be doing this thing, and beyond it was the guiding desire to be rid of every penny of the sovereign his mother had given him to help him appear as a gentleman if he met company. Now it seemed to soil him, coming as it did from her. Curious, that feeling, after all she had done for him, and she his mother. But it would not leave him. The drink he had bought was fast trickling down the many throats that were burning to receive it. The rumor of his prodigality was spreading abroad through Garrodrimna, and men had gone into the highways and the byways to call their friends to the banquet. 2 tramps on their way to the workhouse had heard of it, and were already deep in their pints. Upon John's right hand, arrived as if by magic, stood Seamus C. Gallagher, and upon his left the famous figure of Padna Padna, who was looking up into his face with admiration and brightness, striving hard to replace the stare of vacancy in the dimming eyes. As he drank feverishly, fearful of losing any, Seamus Gallagher continuously ejaculated, "My sweet fellow, John, my sweet fellow." And Padna kept speaking to himself of the grand thing it was that there was one decent fellow left in the world, even if he was only Nan Burns' son. Around John Brennan was a hum of flattery essentially in the same vein, and it seemed to him that, in his own mind, he had soared far beyond them. Outwardly he was drunk, but inwardly he knew himself to be very near that rapture which would bring thoughts of Rebecca as he staggered home alone along the dark road. The companions of his Bacchic night had begun to drift away from him. 10 o'clock was on the point of striking, and he was in such a condition that he might be upon their hands at any moment. They did not want Walter Clinton, the proprietor of the World's End, to be giving any of them the job of taking him home. The hour struck, and the remnant went charging through the doorways like sheep through a gap. Seamus Gallagher limped out, leading Padna by the hand, as if the ancient man had suddenly become metamorphosed into his second childishness. The bloody-looking idiot! They were all sniggering to one another. Wasn't it a hell of a pity that Ned Brennan, his father, and he always bowsying for drink in McDermott's and Brannigan's, wasn't in the World's End tonight? John was alone amidst the dregs of the feast, where the spilt drink was shining on the counter. There was such a sight of glasses as he had never before seen. There were empty glasses, and glasses still standing with half their drink in them, and glasses in which the porter had not been touched, so drunk had everybody been. Walter Clinton came in indignantly and said that it was a shame for him to be in such a state, and to go home out of that at once before the peelers got a hold of him. And he went out with difficulty and down the old road of the elms towards his mother's house in the valley. He could hear the hurrying, heavy feet of those he had entertained so lavishly far down before him on the road. For the moment he was happy. Before his burning eyes was the form of Rebecca Kerr. Her face had a look of quiet loveliness. He thought it was like the faces of the Madonnas in Father O'Keefe's parlor. "Rebecca, Rebecca!" he called to her, ever in the agony of his love. "Thy hands, dear Rebecca." She was not soiled now by any earthly sin, for he had purified her through the miracle of blood, and she was clean like the night wind. He was a pitiable sight as he went staggering on, crying out this ruined girl's name to the night silence of the lonely places. At last he fell somewhere in the soft dewy grass. For a long while he remained here, until he began to realize that his vision was passing, with the decline within him of the flame by which it had been created. The winds upon his face and hair were cold, and it seemed that he was lying in a damp place. His eyes sprang open. He was lying by the lakeside, and at the place where he had murdered Ulick Shannon. He jumped up of a sudden, for his fear had come back to him. With his mouth wide open and a clammy sweat upon his brow, he started to run across what seemed a never-ending grassy space. He broke madly through fences of thorn and barbed wire, which tore his clothes and his hands. He stumbled across fields of tillage. At last, with every limb shivering, he came near his mother's door. Presently he grew coldly conscious. He could hear his father's muttering drunkenly within. He came nearer, striving hard to steady himself and walk erect. He quickened his step to further maintain his pretense of sobriety. His foot tripped against something, and he lurched forward. He was caught in his mother's arms, for at the sound of his approach, she had opened the door in resigned and mournful expectation. "Oh, Jesus," she said. There were two of them now. The end. End of chapter 32. Recording by John Brandon. End of The Valley of the Squinting Windows by Brinsley MacNamara.